Rick Atkinson, what is the Liberation Trilogy?
Well, it's a project, Peter, I began 15 years ago, and it's an account of the liberation of Europe, particularly from the perspective of American and other Western allies. The first volume begins where the liberation of Europe begins, in North Africa in November 1942, with the invasion of Morocco and Algeria, and then the campaign across North Africa. The second volume moves north across the Mediterranean to the invasion of Sicily in July 1942 and southern Italy in September 1943. And then the third volume, this one that has just come out, begins on the eve of the invasion of Normandy. Rome has fallen on June 4th, 1944, and of course D-Day in Normandy is June 6, 1944, and this final volume tells that final chapter of the story all the way through VE Day, Victory in Europe, on May 8th, 1945.
From your book, An Army at Dawn, why did we begin in North Africa?
Because that's where the story really begins. The decision was made by Franklin Roosevelt at the urging of Winston Churchill to not try to cross the English Channel in 1942 or 1943, partly because the American Army was very green commanders, partly because we didn't have the landing craft and the other materiel necessary to undertake that enormous feat. So Roosevelt, contrary to the advice of almost all of his senior military commanders, agreed to invade North Africa in November 1942, and that took place on November 8th. American and British forces fighting not the Germans, because they weren't there yet, not the Italians, but the French. And that's really where the story begins, with us fighting the French.
Why did we begin by fighting the French?
Well, the French had made a deal with the Germans when Hitler invaded France in 1940, and he immediately made his way to Paris. He offered the French a deal with the devil, and the gist of it was, I'll keep the northern two-thirds of France, including Paris. You French can keep the southern one-third with a new capital in the spa town of Vichy, and you can keep your overseas possessions, particularly your colonies in North Africa. And most of the French agreed to this. There were a few renegades who refused, like an obscure brigadier general named Charles de Gaulle, but most of them agreed to it, and so consequently, when we invade North Africa, it's the French who are still there. These are French possessions. Algeria is essentially a state of metropolitan France.
How long did it take to defeat the French?
3 days. And the French army fought pretty indifferently. The French Navy fought ferociously, and one of the biggest naval battles of the Atlantic is Casablanca, and that first couple of days of November 1942. But then the French, it so happened that a senior French admiral, his name was Darlan, was in Algiers at the time. His son had polio. Darlan was at his bedside. He finds himself trapped, basically, by these invading forces. He negotiates a deal with the Americans and the British and agrees that he will surrender North Africa, which happens in the middle of November. So 3 days of fighting and a couple days of heavy wrangling.
Well, Rick Atkinson, you've got a recurring theme through all three of these books. And from An Army at Dawn, The War in North Africa, 1942 to 1943, you write, in September 1939, the U.S. Army had ranked 17th in the world in size and combat power, just behind Romania. When those 136 German divisions conquered Western Europe 9 months later, the War Department reported that it could field just 5 divisions. Even the homeland was vulnerable. Some coastal defense guns had not been test-fired in 20 years, and the Army lacked enough anti-aircraft guns to protect even a single American city. The building of the armed forces was likened to the reconstruction of a dinosaur around an ulna and 3 vertebrae. Then from your second in the trilogy, The Day of Battle, from beginning to end, Allied war-making in the Mediterranean tended to be improvisational. And finally, from The Guns at Last Light, which just came out, you write, the cohesion and internal coherence of the Allied coalition had assured victory. The better alliance had won. Certainly it was possible to look at Allied war-making on any given day and feel heartsick at the missed opportunities and pure-blind personalities and wretched wastage, to wonder why the ranks could not be braver, or at least cleverer, smarter, or at least shrewder, prescient, or at least intuitive. Yet despite its foibles, the Allied way of war won through. And then just to finish that up, an email from Harry Lynn Beck in Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania. At the bottom, we have the soldiers who won the war. They are rewarded for their diligence and stoic demeanor with trench foot, dysentery, lack of clothing, ammunition, support, fuel, and food. They are slaughtered by the hundreds, often by the poor planning of their division, corps, army, and army group commanders. Thousands of these men were wasted for no good purpose. My question, Mr. Beck writes, how did we win the war?
Well, that's a complex question, as you might suspect. To try to simplify it, we won the war through a variety of advantages. We had far more of everything than the Germans had, first of all. Our materiel advantages were enormous. We were creating tens of thousands of airplanes at a time when the Germans were struggling to make just thousands. We made more tanks, more trucks, more ammunition. So that's important, and we were making it in America not only for ourselves and our armed forces, but for our friends. And so we ended up outfitting the British, outfitting almost everything that the French used once they joined the war on our sides, and a substantial portion of what the Soviets and others were supplied with. So that's important. We learned how to fight. I think that's part of what this trilogy is about. We learned from the mistakes that were made beginning in North Africa and then in Italy, and certainly there were more mistakes in Western Europe. But there's a great sifting out that goes on, and it's a sifting out of the competent from the incompetent, commanders at all levels, from platoon leader all the way up to army commander, of the physically fit from the physically unfit, of the lucky from the unlucky. This is the trait that Napoleon most prized in his generals, and it's incredibly important in war. And so by the time we get to the summer of 1944, we're pretty good, and we have a sizable army. And so I think when you put all those things together, and you remember that the Soviets are hammering the Third Reich from the east, they do most of the fighting, they do most of the bleeding, they do most of the killing, and they do most of the dying. 26 million Soviets died in the war. So it's a very good ally to have in the Soviet Union. You put all those things together, and what you have is a winning coalition and a winning formula for global warfare.
You write in The Guns of Last Light, the typical soldier stood 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed 144 pounds, but physical standards had been lowered to accept defects that once would have kept many young men out of uniform. A man with 20/400 vision could now be conscripted if his sight was correctable to at least 20/40 in one eye. Toward that end, the armed forces would make 2.3 million pairs of eyeglasses for the troops. The old jest that the Army no longer examined eyes, but instead just counted them, had come true. Were we short on men?
Terribly short, particularly by the winter of 44-45. And not only that, initially to be drafted, you had to have at least 12 of your natural 32 teeth. By 1944, it's 0, because the Army and Navy have drafted a third of all the dentists in the country to make dentures, to pull teeth, to fill teeth, that sort of thing. You could be drafted in 1944 if you were missing a thumb, if you were missing 3 fingers, including your trigger finger, if you were deaf in one ear. They were drafting 12,000 VD patients a month by 1944, most of them syphilitic. How could they do that? Penicillin. They were making it in huge quantities by 1944. All of this because precisely we were short of men, and particularly we were short of infantrymen, and especially we were short of riflemen. So this is an effort to fill the ranks. Casualties have been running high. We can't forget that 400,000 Americans died during the war, and of that, 291,000 killed in action. And the war falls heaviest always on the infantrymen. And so this is all part of an effort to keep those infantry ranks filled. The Brits did run out of men. So we were in bad shape. The Brits were in terrible shape.
Rick Atkinson, if you could, just give us the macro view of the split between the Pacific and European theaters. How many men, how much resources, et cetera?
Well, the American Army put 89 divisions into the field. About 2/3 of those are in Europe, a little less than 1/3 in the Pacific. All 6 Marine divisions, U.S. Marine Corps divisions, are in the Pacific. Most of the Navy is in the Pacific, including virtually all of the aircraft carriers and most of the bigger battleships. And heavy cruisers and so on. When you look